Oh, this is a big one. My AOS has failed. And that's usually not the case. Now then, I do want to clarify something from last week's episode. If you look at this bad boy down here, can you safely run a 5W40, say, in these engines?
Hey guys, welcome to another Slakker Porsche podcast. This is episode 4, and I am sitting across the engine whisperer himself, Mr. Brandon Clark. Brandon, how is your brain feeling today? Are you ready to unpack some Porsche madness?
I am feeling good. It's been a great week. Had lots of great feedback from our last episode. Almost a little overwhelming, to be honest. Not what I expected, but I feel like that we got the message out and that maybe we'll save an engine or two. And so that's really cool. And then we had a lot of great questions come out of that. And so I think we've got some areas that we could maybe clarify, and then also continue deep diving into subjects such as oils and viscosity and fill levels and the AOS system and how it works. And so, yeah, I'm pretty excited about today.
I'm excited as well. Wouldn't that be cool if we did end up saving an engine because of the video, even if it's just one?
Right?
That'd be nice.
Definitely.
So let's jump into these questions then. I have them written down here on my phone. The first question I have here, I believe it's from Rinlist. It is from DW997. And it says, on a wet sump engine, I've always wanted to ensure the running oil level does not allow the crankshaft to dip in the oil, thus aerating the precious fluid. Could you add some comment on how much cushion level wise there is on these engines? Thank you, and keep posting these excellent videos.
That's a great question. But before we dive into that actual question, it depends on which model you have. And so Porsche has actually changed their mind a time or two. Initially, the 996.1 had one oil level. And then they actually shortened the dipstick sometime around the 996.2 and came up with a shorter level. So they decreased the capacity by, we'll call it roughly a quart. And then with the 987 and 997.1s, they took away the dipstick altogether. You know, many people ask, why did they do that? Why were they shortening it, essentially reducing the fill level? And then why did they take it away? And I think the greatest insight into that is their explanation of the oil level sensor and how it works. And so reading from Porsche documentation, if we look at Porsche's explanation of the oil level sensor itself, it said previously all of the oil had to return to the oil pan after the engine was shut off before the oil level could be measured. To enable accurate measurement of the oil level, the necessary time required to achieve this state was ensured by means of a waiting time for oil level measurement determined according to the oil temperature and length of time the engine has been off. So if anybody's ever disconnected their battery and tried to reconnect it and tried to measure the oil, they'll get a 60-minute wait time. Now then, one little hack is if you start your engine and then shut it off, that will decrease it usually to about 30 minutes. Still, it's a fairly annoying thing. Continuing on, with MAP compensation, the actual measured oil level in the oil pan is compensated to take in account the oil temperature and length of time the engine has been off. The oil is not yet returned to the pan, is electronically calculated and theoretically added, and the calculated oil level is displayed in the instrument cluster as quickly as possible. So what the heck does this mean? So it means that what we already know, as we discussed in the last show, oil gets trapped in the heads on these engines and it takes a while to return. And so initially, the overfill issue from Porsche was coming not necessarily because it was overfilled, but because the oil was measured while much of the oil was still trapped in the heads. And so people would pull out their dipstick, they'd see they're a quart low, they'd add a quart, and then all of a sudden they're a quart overfilled. So initially, to compensate for this, Porsche lengthened the dipstick, thereby reducing the amount that it showed filled to try and prevent that overfill from happening. That made some progress. However, obviously it wasn't good enough because in '05, they took away our ability to use a dipstick altogether. One thing we do on race builds is we do offer actually putting the dipstick back in the car. But regardless of whether it's a dipstick or oil fill level, the best way to always measure your oil is to let the car sit overnight on the 996s and the 997.1s and the 987.1s. Allow the car to sit overnight, the oil to come down in temperature to essentially room temperature, if you will, and then measure it on level ground before restarting it. So this is going to give a consistent way of measuring it every time. It's going to allow the bulk of the oil to have returned to the heads, especially if it was run fairly hard previously. And so that allows that oil to drain down from the heads and gives you a consistent way to measure the oil. Otherwise, you're going off of the oil level sensor and you're not measuring the actual oil level, you're measuring a calculated or a map compensated level. So that's why I always say measure your oil after allowing it to sit overnight and before starting it again on level ground.
Makes sense.
So that being said, we know there's different oil levels based on the year. And so yes, that needs to be taken into account. But one thing interesting is in '09, they changed that model altogether. And there's a whole different set of rules. So this just applies to the 996s and 9X7.1s. Now then, let's see what that oil level looks like that we're actually measuring it. How close is it getting to the crank when we measure?
Okay.
So to start with, I've added a crank carrier half to this case half. And so essentially we'll use the side of the crank carrier as the measurement point since the rods do go up and down or essentially side to side when this is oriented correctly. However, the crank does not come outside of this area. So if I measure from here to here as a baseline, then we're going to be right at, we'll say approximately 145, 146 millimeters. From previous testing, we know that the top fill level on this oil level sensor is approximately 70 millimeters up the sensor. So if we start out, for our distance to the sensor is 40 millimeters from the bottom. And then we add 70 millimeters to that. So it's going to take me up to about 110 millimeters. So this is where the fill level's going to be at essentially 5 bars or just slightly overfilled. We also know that it's approximately 12.5 millimeters per liter in the sump area up into a point. And so if we go 12.5 more, so we go from 110 to 122, we've still got a pretty good distance there, or essentially 122 to 146. So we still have almost a full inch from the crank carrier even at 1 liter overfilled. Now then, I do want to clarify something from last week's episode. When we talk about overfilling the engine, we're talking about for track use specifically, where we know there's going to be a lot of oil trapped in the heads and we know that the engine's going to be at its greatest risk. And we're typically talking about using it with a motorsport AOS or a UAOS. And we'll get into those a little bit more after bit.
Perfect. Are you ready for the next question?
Yes.
All right, let's do that. Alex B76 asks, isn't running 15W50 or so would cause issues for street cars in cold climates? Number 2, would a liquid moly or Motul 50W40 be a good alternative if you drive in cold weather? And 3, I once ran the car with full oil line on track. It smoked like crazy, as in the corners. The oil got into the AOS. How do you prevent that?
Okay, so once again, three great questions. Can you safely run a 5W40, say, in these engines? And the answer is yes, it is possible. Remember, what we're looking to do is solve the issue of oil starvation. We've seen it happen time and time again on track. We've seen it happen multiple times on the street. It is the number one engine failure we see. And so if you never have oil starvation, then yeah, a 5W40 or something better than the originally spec'd 0W40 M1 is going to probably adequately protect your car. A good example of that is the 255,000-mile engine we got. They did run liquid moly 5W40. It was driven fairly hard, but it was primarily, on and off ramps and a lot of highway miles. And it was also in a warm climate. And that engine looked pretty good when we got it in here. Now then, if they were running into situations that could cause oil starvation, i.e., their oil fill level was maybe halfway between min and max, or maybe it burned off some oil and was down at the minimum line, there are some circumstances where that would still be at risk. And so what we're trying to do is protect in those circumstances. So if this is a Sunday driver and you just like to enjoy your Porsche for what it is, or you want to baby it, this may not be relevant to you. However, if you drive the cars as I believe they were meant to be driven, hard, aggressively, red line, through long sweepers and turns and on ramps and track, then that's what we're targeting. That's who's going to be susceptible to this, and it's easy to fix. Like, these cars are meant to be driven. However, it just takes a little bit of education. And so those are our target audience for this information specifically. Now then, diving into oil viscosity levels, I do think that that's one of the most misunderstood subjects. Most people hear 10W60 and they think, wow, that's going to be like molasses in my engine. And, at negative 10 degrees Celsius, it's going to be pretty thick. But so is a 0W20 at that point. And so let's look at exactly what we're looking at on the viscosity levels at different temperatures based on some of these oils. And I've got a few graphics that I'll share, and we can dive into it from there.
Let's do it.
This graphic here was one that was just shared today by Porsche Tech 3, aka Charles Brazil, the inventor of the UAOS, and it has cold crank viscosity at low temps. If we look at this chart, we're looking at a 10W60 at negative 25 degrees, which probably not the best use of a 10W60, but essentially it's about equivalent to a 0W20 at negative 35 degrees. So the delta isn't nearly what most people would imagine. And as you can see from this graph here, by the time you get to negative 10, negative 5, 0 degrees Celsius, they start blending together pretty quickly. So, if you're going to be driving in negative 20 or negative 25, no, 10W60 is probably not for you. If you're going to be over, say, 0 degrees Fahrenheit is going to be about the coldest you're going to drive, then it's probably going to be just fine, assuming that you start up the car and you allow it to idle and warm up the oil at a very, essentially zero load or near zero load at that point. And then as the oil comes up to temp, you can, give it 5 or 10 minutes in that cold of weather, and then start driving it. You can drive it gingerly or normally until the oil starts to come up around that 200 degree Fahrenheit, 150 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Generally, that's going to be about when you'll see the coolant temp or the engine coolant temp come up to about that 170, 180 Fahrenheit mark that it tends to stick at on the 987s and 997s, somewhat artificially. And so then, once again, regardless of the temperature outside, you can start driving it aggressively again.
That's when you're at your safest.
Another chart I like to use comes from Driven's, I believe, their 2019 catalog, and it shows their line of race oils at different temperatures. So if we start at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, their XP0, which is literally their zero weight oil, versus their XP9, which is their 15W50, there's a pretty good gap between them, but both are below essentially what 1200 centistrokes is, where you really start getting concerned about the engine when you're running it, and you want to let it warm up more and get below that. And so both of these are well within range of running the engine. However, I wouldn't want to run it aggressively or add load until it comes closer up to temperature. But as you look, as they get hotter and hotter, by the time you're at 212 degrees, where the second number comes into play, there is, probably, 15 centistrokes maybe difference between the two. And as you go up further up the curve, say up here around probably about 250 degrees Fahrenheit, generally we want to see above 14 centistrokes when we're running oil. That's essentially a 40 weight. The XP9, the 15W50, is barely up at about that 12 or 13 mark at that point. And so that's where the thicker viscosity comes in. Now then, I've got another chart here, one that we have calculated, goes into it a little bit deeper, and we can make this information available in the comments. The 10W60 oil at that first rating is 162 centistrokes. So while it's still up there a little bit, it's still within an operating temperature that's reasonable. But then when you get up here to 212, it's already down to 23 centistrokes. By the time we're up to 230, which is not unusual, 220 to 230, to see a street-driven car that is maybe in some traffic or in some warmer weather, it's not unusual to see that. And then, of course, for track use, like I said, we want to stay kind of in that above that 40 weight range. And so this oil can handle up to 250, even up to 260, and still be safe. So while typically a purpose-built race car may have additional cooling that will help stay below that level, a lot of times we will see street cars that still have the condensers on them, and maybe the radiators haven't been cleaned in a while, and they still have all of the fender liners in place and don't have good airflow through there. It's not unusual to see oil temps up in that 250, 260 range. And so that's why we like a good 60 weight oil, so we can essentially get, at 13.7, that's essentially a 30 weight oil. We want 30 weight oil performance out of these. And so you can see that we get good protection, even up to kind of that 270 degree range, but we're only talking about 11 centistrokes difference between 212 and 270. And so since we see that as the typical driving range, or where we would be putting load on the engine on a consistent basis, whether it's driving around town, driving, carving canyons, or driving on track, that's why we say, yeah, this is still a good oil for street use. Now then, all right, so looking at this used oil analysis here, this engine has a little over 3,000 miles on it with Motul 300V 10W60. And what we're looking at is, one, the wear metals look pretty good. This engine has about 11,000 miles on it since it was built, and it is wearing in nicely, so we're pretty happy with that. But if we look at the additive package, essentially the biggest difference in the DI line or the 300V line is that we see lower detergent levels. And so the calcium and the magnesium and the sodium as well, those constitute our detergent levels. And so we see lower detergent, but still, a significant or a meaningful amount in order to still keep the engine clean over a reasonably long period of time. We'll say 4,000 to 5,000 miles typically. And then the phosphorus and moly, so the 550 and the 865, those are our anti-friction or our wear package or our protection package. And so what we really want to see is some evenness between this. Now then, the other advantage to the lower calcium is that prevents what's called LSPI, or low speed pre-ignition, essentially low speed knock. And that's something that the direct injection engines get into. So having that balance gives us that extra protection that we would want in, say, a race oil, but have it applicable for street use. And so this one at 3,000 miles, we're not seeing any significant degradation in the additive package. The viscosity is still holding strong. The flash point looks good. Like this oil's wearing well and is done well. And so that's how we can say, yeah, the 10W60 works well for street use. Now then, are we recommending that for all street use? No, not necessarily. Depending on, how a car is used. However, what we are saying is that if somebody wants to go to the track this weekend and run 10W60 in their car, they can do that. And then they can come home and continue using it on the street. They don't have to change oils in between. They'll want to up their change interval depending on what those track sessions look like. Generally, we say 1 hour track time's equivalent to about 500 miles for change intervals. However, it's not like they have to invest all this money in this expensive boutique oil and then just dump it and go back to a street oil. It can work for both.
It's good to know. To save you a buck.
Yep. So as far as the Motul 15W50 or the Molly 5W50, one question was, which Molly was that? And it is the Molly Gin. Specifically, that's one that's just been a very popular oil. We've anecdotally seen it run 255,000 miles with a little lower weight in a car successfully. And so we're still doing extended testing with that oil. So far, we've been pretty pleased with the results. It's maybe not as high of a quality of an oil as what we would see with the Driven DI line or the Motul 300V line. And when I say that, it's referring to, there's a couple things. One, when we're talking about the quality of oils, the first thing that we're interested in is the HTHS value, or the high temperature, high shear value. Essentially, when a oil is under stress, i.e. high heat on a bearing, or we've got a little bit of starvation or an event happening, it's that HTHS number that's going to matter the most. And typically on some of the oils like a Molly Gin or maybe some of the other street oils out there, that HTHS number is typically going to be lower than what we would like to see, and typically what you'll see in a race type oil. The other thing is on the additive package and the viscosity modifiers. Typically on the higher quality oils, we're going to see that viscosity maintain itself longer. We're going to see the additive package maintain itself longer and not wear out. And so that's why we really like the MPAO oils typically.
The last one, I believe, is the question about running the car with full oil line on track. It smoked like crazy, as in corners the oil that into the AOS. How do you prevent that?
Oh, this is a big one. So this one's going to take a minute. To answer that question, we really need to deep dive. What is the AOS? What does it do? What does the pathway look like for it? And it's a combination of things that come into play. Now then, most people, when they overwhelm their AOS and they have a smoking event, they often say, my AOS has failed. And that's usually not the case. Most times when that happens, yes, it's been overloaded. However, that does not mean that the diaphragm itself has busted or anything like that. That is typically verified using a manometer and measuring the crankcase pressure with that AOS still there. And oftentimes, most people will find that no, the AOS did not fail. It just got overwhelmed. So then let's get into, okay, why do AOSs get overwhelmed? And so to answer that question, we need to look at first, where does the AOS go and where does it get its oil from whenever it is getting more than it can handle? And then also, what are some other extenuating factors in that equation? And so let's start diving in.
Let's dive in.
All right, so first of all, what is an AOS and what it does? And here's two different stock AOSs. This one's from a 987 Cayman. You can tell because it doesn't have any coolant ports on it. Whereas this one is from a 3.6 liter 997.1 or potentially a 996.2. It's got coolant ports, which help reduce oil vaporization. And then essentially you've got two inputs to it. One coming from bank 2, and then this one right here, which sits on top of bank 1. Now then, its job is to bleed off crankcase pressure. And so all engines have some bit of blow by. And so not only do we want to bleed off that crankcase pressure, but then it goes to the intake manifold is where it bleeds it off. And that intake manifold, especially under throttle, is going to be pulling a vacuum on this. And so it is that creating a crankcase vacuum. And then there's a bladder up here that not only does the separation, but also essentially works as a valve to determine how much vacuum is allowed in the crankcase or that the crankcase can have. So when we say an AOS is failed or is working, what we can do is we can simply put a manometer or a device that measures vacuum, connect it to the crankcase, typically through the oil cap. And as long as we see a range of -4 to -6 inches of water, which is less than, I think, a quarter of a PSI essentially, then we know that the AOS essentially through this bladder is performing its job. What the bladder does is it allows the gases to escape through here or the crankcase pressure and pulls the vacuum. And then this right here is what essentially drains the oil back down into the case. Where that sits is on top of both heads. So this is bank 2. It will have a port coming off of here and going to the other side. And then this sits on top of bank 1. How does this get overwhelmed? I think most people assume, well, the oil sloshes from the sump and just sloshes up into it. Well, okay, let's take a look at that. So on all of the 9X6, 9X7, N.1 NA engines, except for the 997.1S, the AOS sits on top of the bank 1 head. And then there's a hose that goes around and goes to the other head. Now then, the other head and through that hose is not much of a risk factor typically. The risk factor is here at the AOS, where we're bringing it in right here. And so I think a lot of people think if it's overfilled, it's going to just slosh up and land in the AOS. Well, let's look and see what it would take for that to happen. If we come over to this side, so essentially we've got our crank carrier here, if you'll imagine, and then our oil level is typically going to be up to here-ish. Maybe a little above this windage tray, but somewhere right in here, depending on fill level. And remember, 1 extra quart is essentially 12.5 millimeters or about half an inch of fill level. So about that much. Now then, what that's going to have to do to get up into the AOS is, one, it's going to have to travel here. And as you can see, we've got 2 chain guides. And then typically on IMS here, this is where our crankshaft goes. This is where our IMS goes. There's a chain going across our IMS through these chain guides. Okay. And then if we come back over here, we can imagine having our intake cam, our exhaust cam in place, and we've got the chain coming from that chain guide. It's being pushed up by a tensioner and going across here. And so the path of travel that the oil would have to essentially slosh from that side all the way up past these. And then you can see we've got this chain tensioner or this chain guide here. Now then, if I pull the AOS off and we look inside of this, get a little bit of light in there, you can see that that chain guide almost completely blocks it off. If you come a little further this way, it's got a little rubber flap on it that blocks this side, and then it's closed off there. So it's very difficult for the oil to slosh all the way up here based on an extra, 12 millimeters down here. So do I think that overfill is a leading contributor to AOS getting overwhelmed and, going through the intake and then going down to the cylinders? No, I don't actually. But however, I still don't recommend overfilling without an upgraded or modified AOS. And so what that means is there's two versions. One is the Motorsports AOS, and we don't actually have one of those out of the car, so we've got to take a field trip and go look inside of a car. So if you look at this is the stock AOS, and it probably holds, maybe we'll call this half a liter of oil. It's got this small little drain back, and it's got the two intakes right here for bleeding off pressure, and then it's got the outlet that goes to the intake manifold that pulls the vacuum. It's not a bad piece. But then if you look at this bad boy down here, is the 996 GT3 Motorsport AOS. And so if there was any question if the stock AOS can handle the additional oil consumption or keep from getting overloaded by oil, this sucker takes care of it. Figure probably 3 times the capacity of the stock AOS. It's got a higher quality diaphragm on it. This diaphragm typically pulls between -7 and -8 inches of water of vacuum, whereas we typically see -4 to -6 inches of vacuum off the stock AOS. And it's just a model that we really like. We don't see any issues out of it. It's well designed, it's well done. So the other type of stock AOS that we typically see comes on the 997.1S. And so what it's done is put essentially these remotes on each side. And if you can look inside there, it's literally just a plastic kind of separator device. And so these are non-wear. We don't typically even replace these as long as there's no sign of cracking or aging. And then one of these on each head feeds to this, which is mounted in the middle of the block here. Now then, as you can see, as far as these go, there's not much difference in size on this AOS versus this one. Generally it does pretty good, but we've done a little sawing on it, but generally it does pretty good. But if we want to upgrade this one, we cannot use the Motorsport AOS. And so we instead use the UAOS or Ultimate AOS. So what they've done here is they've taken essentially a stock AOS and removed the bladder from here, and they've got believe they've got something in here if we opened it up that kind of helps the oil accumulate and drain back down. But then they pipe, and so this is a piece that's essentially a non-functioning piece. It's not something that you would have to replace on down the line, which, since this is a hard position to get to in the 996s and 997s, is really a bonus. But then it's piped to this second reservoir, which essentially doubles the capacity. And then this reservoir goes through an upgraded diaphragm, which is longer lasting. It's a really hefty piece, and then this diaphragm is what goes into the intake manifold. The version that we use also has a drain here, and so as opposed to worrying about a catch can accumulating oil and having to check it, this actually drains back into the oil tube and back into the engine. So it's a well-designed, nice piece. It's pretty popular. We get requested this on a decent amount of time, and if somebody wants to upgrade their AOS on the 3.8, it's really our only option. Okay, Ricardo, that's a lot of information. Thoughts? Is there anything that we should go back over? Any questions at this point?
I think we nailed it, but hopefully the people that are watching have questions, and if they do, they can write them down in the comment section, and we can do our best to get to them next week.
Yep. A lot of mystery surrounds the AOS and what it does. So hopefully by looking at the different kinds of AOSs that are available, having a better understanding of the path the oil would have to take to get up into here, hopefully demystifies it some. But then if it's so hard to get up, how does the oil get up there, right? And so what our theory is it has everything to do with aeration and foaming of the oil. That's the only way that we can imagine, since, obviously filling it up to here isn't going to make any difference. That's the only way we can imagine it getting in. And so that's going to be more typical with a street oil, that not only can it foam, but also typically as a lower viscosity index, it's also going to get more aeration. It's going to be lighter weight. We're just going to see a lot more of that. And so that's why we like the heavier oils, the heavier race oils that have anti-foaming agents in them and can help prevent that foaming, the overwhelming of the AOS, and ultimately the sucking in oil into the intake. One other key piece is on the higher end oils that we like. They have a lower VII on them, which is the tendency to vaporize. That also is another piece, is a lot of times, maybe the AOS didn't get overwhelmed and start smoking, but they'll see smoke on startup. And what that essentially is when that oil vapor makes it past the AOS, it coats the intake with just a light film. And so you don't really see it when you're driving, but when that engine's had time to cool and all of that vapor essentially has time to drain down the intakes and into the cylinders, you get a puff of smoke on that first startup, and then you don't see any more after that. One other key point that I want to make or to look at is on deep sump design. And I also believe this plays a part in it. Here we have two deep sumps. One is the Hartech sump that we've had excellent luck with and seen really good data from. Another one is a popular 2-quart deep sump that I had heard anecdotally, people had told me, well, it will cause the AOS to get overwhelmed. And it was difficult to understand that until if you go with the foaming theory, which is what makes sense to me, is the only way the oil could get up here and get past the AOS. If you look at the Hartech sump, it has this barrier along here that keeps the oil around the pan and doesn't let it slosh back and forth. Whereas this sump is essentially open all the way across here and would allow the oil to slosh back and forth unimpeded. And so if it was a lower quality oil that had a tendency to foam, we believe that's going to lead to that foaming and allow that oil to propagate up and through the AOS.
Are you ready for the last question?
I think we're ready for a last question.
All right. This one goes, I use driven DT40 in my 2007 987.1 Boxster S. You mentioned DI50, but not DT40. Can you give me more information on if me and others using BT40 should switch to DI50? Thank you. And this is from Ryan Gower 6785.
Okay, so I think this is a great wrap-up question for us. We've gone over one, viscosity and how it works. We've gone over the sump and the oil fill levels. We've talked about the path of AOSs and all the different types of AOSs that we are. And we've talked about the theory that foaming is the critical piece for overloading an AOS. So whereas DT40 is a good oil, couple of things. One, it's lower weight, so it's going to be more prone to aeration. Two, it's a street oil, so it's also going to be more prone to foaming. And so first and foremost, we like race oils for the engines. They're going to have less foaming, less opportunity to overwhelm the AOS, and they're going to have a higher HTHS, which means they're going to hold up much better under high temperature, high shear situations. And so we don't know if every engine is going to be in that type of a situation or is going to need that oil, but we do know that it doesn't hurt to run it. There is no downside from what we've seen based on the data to this point. And two, if they ever do get in that type of a situation, we know that they're protected. And so that's why we recommend those oils. We have, based on kind of the uniqueness of the M9X engines, these seem to be the best oils, the ones that we've discussed for dealing with those issues today. And so anyway, coming up, I'm excited. We've got some track day testing for oils. We're going to put them under different situations and go through some very methodical ways of testing them and seeing which oils hold up best under track type situations in a street car. We're going to use my 996.2, which does not have a new engine in it. It is due for a rebuild at some point in the near future. And so if something happens, God forbid, it'll be okay, but we're going to push that one to the limit. We're going to see which oils are actually protecting it in that situation and which oils aren't.
Are you taking me to the track?
Yes, Ricardo, I'm taking you to the track.
I've never been to the track, let alone with a camera, so this is going to be exciting.
Yep.
I'm excited. In your car?
Yes.
Okay. Ooh, stay tuned. I'm excited. That's okay. Well, thank you for watching. This has been an eventful episode 4, and we look forward to episode 5.
Yep. Thanks everyone for joining us. Drive hard, wrench smart, and see you on the next lap.